Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Simon spoke to author and journalist Alex Perry, who is known for his book, The Good Mothers.
So Alex I've known for some years since we worked together at Newsweek. He's been something of a mentor to me. Great to have him on the show. He's got a very varied background. He was a foreign correspondent for Time magazine. He covered the war in Afghanistan, and in recent years he's gone freelance and moved into writing books and also doing some really interesting TV projects.
Hope you enjoy the episode.
So I'm here with the author and journalist Alex Perry. We're doing this interview via Skype, so I apologise for any issues with the audio quality. Alex is in France at the moment. But Alex, it's really great to have you on the show. I know you've been a supporter of Always Take Notes for a long time. I was wondering if we could start by talking a bit about your early life and your initial interest in kind of writing and journalism and literary affairs. Where did that come from?
I guess in some ways I'm a bit of a fraud because I never really had a sort of great burning desire to be a writer, and that has happened almost by accident. I became a journalist because I saw the movie Salvador and thought James Woods' character was great. And
I'm not familiar with that movie. What happens? Presumably it's set in El Salvador.
He's a photographer who goes to cover the civil war in Salvador, drinks an enormous amount of whiskey. His best friend is shot trying to take a picture of an incoming airstrike. He falls in love with a Salvadorian woman and manages to smuggle out some film. It's an Oliver Stone movie.
Okay.
And he takes us James Belushi along as a sort of rock DJ companion.
Okay.
It just looked fantastic to me, and I just saw it at a moment when I was trying to decide what to do with my life, and that looked great.
And then how did you go about actually making your entry to journalism?
Well, so obviously, immediately I went to work for the Great Yarmouth Mercury, which seemed to be, the most direct route I could find.
Right.
I went to Cardiff, did that course for a year, and the only job I could get was on the Great Yarmouth Mercury. On £7,000 a year, which was slightly brilliant, paying us that little because it meant we couldn't actually afford a train ticket to London.
Okay.
So I was there for 2.5 years, and but that did teach me a lot. And there was Great Yarmouth. I don't know if you know it. It's a seaside resort that died decades ago, about half a century ago, actually.
Yeah.
And now fills all its guest houses with people on benefits, and in the nice county of Norfolk, it was our job to come up with all the crime, because Yarmouth had a lot of it. There was a few murders every year and rapes, quite a lot of drugs. It was horrible social decay, and that was my patch.
And was it clear this was what, sort of late 90s that you're doing this?
Early 90s, mate. Yeah.
Okay. Was it clear that this was a route to the big time and the bright lights, or were there people who were sort of going to start at the Great Yarmouth Mercury and finish at the Great Yarmouth Mercury as well?
There were those. There were those for whom the big time was working for Anglia TV.
Okay.
There were definitely people that were staying in East Anglia, but there were some people who went to the Nationals. That was as far as anybody's ambitions kind of went.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of idea that we did 2 or 3 years apprenticeship, penance, call it what you like, and then you were able to call yourself sort of qualified and able to start sort of moving on.
Yeah.
It's kind of remnants of the old apprenticeship system in print journalism, I guess.
Yeah. And didn't you have a spell at teletext as well in your early career?
Yeah. So I did all the great jobs. Great Yarmouth Mercury. Then I worked for a terrible news agency in Leicester that was trying to rival the Press Association as a kind of national news agency, but amazingly doing it by doing almost no reporting at all, so there was some reporting on the phone, but you definitely didn't leave the office.
Okay.
Because there were so few people.
Right.
and we were just rip and run merchants, ripping everybody off. It was on the BBC. Basically, we more or less counted that as our interview and just sort of quoted it and wrote a story. And I was there for a year or so, and then my big move to London. I was working for Teletext on the night shift, which for those that don't know, it was kind of like an early version of the internet on your TV. You could get text stories basically on the size of a TV screen. That meant you were limited to 3 sentences actually for an entire story, and there was no way of justifying the text. You couldn't squash it or expand it. You had to get the letters exactly right to be able to fit on the screen. That was a real art. And then 5 years of all those cruddy jobs, I managed to get a job at Agence France Presse, the French news agency, as a reporter, and they took their beat to include from the London office to include Northern Ireland and actually all the British territories in the Caribbean as well. So that was kind of my start really in what I wanted to do. And foreign trips came. I mean, my first assignment overseas was to go and cover a volcano in Montserrat in the Caribbean, which was just amazing.
And during that time that you were doing your apprenticeship or penance or whatever one would phrase it, did any of the sort of desire, did that kind of bright excitement at doing this that you had got from that film and so forth, did that flame stay alive, or did it, what was your...
Oh yeah, no, very much so. And then I think I began to realize that it might actually be possible to get there if I kept kind of plugging away at it and kept focus on the prize. And AFE was one way to... I mean, wire copy is not the most interesting to write a lot of the time, but it did get me around. Yeah. And I moved with them to Hong Kong as an editor on the desk. But I got a few assignments. I went and covered an earthquake in Taiwan and the handover of Macau to China. It was step by step. And then while I was in Hong Kong, I joined Time magazine, and with very lucky timing, just before 9/11, and that was the Asia office of Time magazine. Afghanistan was in their patch, and I although I was very much the junior reporter, there was a rather elderly reporter who was sent to Afghanistan and really didn't want to be there, and I literally on my knees persuaded my editor to allow me to replace him. Okay. And I guess that my career was definitely slow, and this is 10 years in by then. But if I had a break at any point, that was my break.
Sure. And can we talk about this extraordinary story that you send over about from Afghanistan in late 2001? I don't want to mispronounce it, but Kuala, the prison break piece. Yeah. How did this all come about?
So again, I mean, an enormous amount of luck. I was in Uzbekistan on the Afghan border with about 250 other journalists. I'd been friends with a French guy who had his own slightly extraordinary story. He'd been selling shampoo for L'Oreal in Uzbekistan, and when the war started, just decided that the journalism looked more fun. Okay. And but Damien was one of the most charming people you'll ever meet. I mean, so on the border was this completely intransigent Uzbek press chief who was not going to let anybody do anything that they wanted, particularly across the border. But, while everyone else sort of fumed and kicked the door and whatever, Damien took him out for dinner. And the guy offered him a few places on this barge that was the border between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan is a river. Yeah. And Damien was offered a few sort of seats on a barge that was delivering some grain across. And the idea was that we covered the great sort of munificence of the Uzbek people sending grain to the poor, starving people of Afghanistan. And I got one of those spots, and of course, as soon as it touched land on the other side, I just walked off into Afghanistan. Okay. And I mean, you've covered a few war zones yourself. They're never quite as dangerous as everybody makes out and as your imagination conjures up. And I walked out of this small sort of port facility, found a taxi, and more or less said, "Take me to the war." And that was it. I was, it was slightly amazing. That's all it took, really, to be first man into northern Afghanistan. And I had the whole thing to myself for about 2 weeks.
What happened to the man from L'Oreal?
I'm still in touch with him.
Okay.
he caught up with me a little bit later. Unfortunately, he was with a French crew that didn't want to go, even though they had the opportunity.
Okay.
But he made up for it later. I got, because he was working for a TV crew, I got hold of some film that was immensely valuable. It showed Mike Spann, who was the CIA agent and the first American to be killed in Afghanistan, interrogating John Walker Lind, who was the American Taliban.
Yeah.
I think probably my bosses at the time were trying to sort of. Well, we were all still, early days of the internet. I didn't quite realize what video might mean to the website of Time magazine, so I just passed it over to my friend, who promptly sold it for $55,000 to every broadcaster in the world.
And how did you end up at this? It was a prison break, basically. That was what happened.
Yeah. So in northern Afghanistan, it was falling pretty rapidly. The Special Forces the American Special Forces and a few Brits had done an incredible job linking up with Northern Alliance, particularly General Dostum, and they'd swept through most of Afghanistan, most of northern Afghanistan, and they'd taken a lot of prisoners, about 8,000 or 9,000, but they'd sifted them, and there were about 400 that were thought to be of interest to CIA types, basically foreigners. But they had taken these 400 people to this old fort in the middle of the desert, shoved them into the dungeons. They hadn't bothered to disarm them. There was no order to it. They put minimal guards on them. And a few days later, when they brought them all out, 400 of them, to be interrogated by 2 CIA guys guarded by about 20 people, unsurprisingly, these Taliban / Al Qaeda suspects rose up and started a rebellion inside this prison fort, and that battle went on for about a week.
And where were you while this was going on?
Well, again, I was just blessed with luck at this point. Everyone was. By then, a few, there were maybe sort of 20 reporters around. They were all charging off, as far from memory, to Kunduz. For me, working for a weekly, I reckoned that there was no point doing what everybody else was doing. So I was on my way south to go and look at a sort of stray American airstrike. And my taxi broke down just outside of town, and we fixed it. But as we were fixing it, I was standing outside, and I could just hear this pop, pop, pop of gunfire in the distance. And so we fixed the car, went back into town, and I said to my fixer, let's go and see what that is. And he was like, no, it'd be nothing. It'll just be a wedding or something like that. And we walk up to this old fort, and this rather sort of jumpy guard comes out and says, what do you want? What do you want? There's nothing going on here. And we can hear the gunfire. And I'm sort of saying, I think there's something going on here. And as I'm saying that, an RPG round splits the air between us, basically, and explodes in a field about 50 yards away. At which point he sort of shrugs his shoulders and goes, okay, there is something going on. And and they let us in. And it was, that first early stage of a battle. I mean, this never happened to me, later in the 20 years later, that you come across a battle as it's beginning. But that was the one time I managed to do that. And as a battle is beginning, it's complete chaos, and everyone's got far better things to do than take care of some reporter. So we had sort of freedom, really, to sort of walk around, talk to people, say, first of all, to gauge what was safe and what wasn't, and then sort of kind of find our various spots where we could sit and observe and reasonably safely and kind of record the progress of this battle.
And a lot has kind of been discussed in the time since then about, young journalists, particularly freelancers, which I suppose you weren't at that time, but people going into combat or other danger zones, as kind of young people with fairly limited experience, and for some it really works out and some it doesn't. What are your kind of thoughts on that kind of thing, and how one should approach that kind of work?
Look, I mean, it worked out for me. I survived. There was a friend of mine who was shot in the chest and survived. Walked 10 yards from where I'd been sitting, and I wrote a story that won several awards and got included in Best American something reporting or writing. Anyway, some kind of anthology, and it kind of established me, really. I mean, in fact, it still goes on to this day. I get asked to sort of take part in kind of historical documentaries and so on. But, as you say, I wasn't freelance. I was staff at Time magazine, but I had zero training. I didn't have a flak jacket. My sat phone had broken almost as soon as I picked it up. Mm-hmm. And I had I would say I had no idea what I was doing. And, Tess, my wife, will tell you that I picked up a decent dose of PTSD from that as well. Just being for 3 or 4 days in very close proximity to people killing each other was well, at the time it was an incredibly adrenalizing, electric experience, but it was extremely hard to come down off that, for several years. So yeah, I mean, I would say even the richest staff positions at that stage, Time magazine was a hugely profitable magazine. They had no idea what they were doing. I had no idea what I was doing, but they put no work into prep. They didn't, I mean, later I went to Iraq and they, instead of a flat vest, they gave me a skateboard vest, which might save you from a bit of nasty chafing if you fall off your board. So I think all media was woefully out of practice at war, to be honest, and they didn't address it quickly enough after that initial sort of hail of fire, and for years afterwards. They were, the whole thing was woefully substandard, and it was, you got through these things or you didn't, largely based on luck.
And how were you able to physically file your story as well? If your sat phone had broken, how did you get your copy out?
So, well, my sat phone was able to do voice but not text, so I dictated. At some point I found myself basically dictating trench while the guy next to me fired off clip after clip of his AK. Actually, it was weird that that was, I'm being quite rude about Time magazine, but there was a very good editorial decision then. Whoever on the other end just took that absolutely verbatim and put it out with the noise of gunfire, with my slightly hysterical laughing every now and then. And it was a very, actually weirdly, even though I had nothing to do with writing it, that's one of my sort of the things I'm most proud of. It's really a visceral piece of reporting. You're right there in the trenches as everything happens.
Yeah, it's very powerful. I mean, did it feel as well that you had in some cases, or in some way, reached an aspect or a level of journalism that was what you had wanted to do, perhaps, the Salvador kind of thing after all that?
Yeah, no, it did. It did. I mean, and I was slightly pinching myself. This is what I wanted. I've amazingly, I've got to where I want to be, and even more amazingly, it hasn't let me down. It turns out to be exactly what I wanted. I absolutely loved it. And it totally changed my life. And it was everything I wanted it to be. It wasn't a false god, it was. I mean, I would say the only downside to that was I ran after war for a good sort of 10 years, if not more, after that. Just going for that experience. Actually, in the end, I worked out that the experience that I'd had that first time, it was never going to be that again. There was just so many flukes involved in being in precisely the right time, a number of different times, and the right moment and the right place. That for the rest of my career, I was always doing aftermath, or sometimes years afterwards. So yeah, no, it totally fulfilled all my expectations, even exceeded them. But it was sorry.
Can we talk then about the years that followed? So you then were a staff foreign correspondent for Time in India
Yeah.
and in Africa. I mean, did it? I suppose in retrospect, it's easy to sort of regard that as something of like the end of an era of these staff foreign correspondent roles. For obviously some of them still exist for the New York Times and so forth. But did it feel like this was something that was going to go on forever, or did it? Could you see
No,
change?
I knew from the beginning that it was slightly doomed. And my thought process was simply, I'm going to ride this strange torpedo all the way to the end.
Yeah.
Just see how long it lasts. And in the end, it lasted quite a long time. I did, after Afghanistan, I got the bureau chief job in India. That was 5 years. And then I got the bureau chief job in Africa. That was 8.
Mm-hmm.
There are, I think, about 2 or 3 foreign correspondents at Time magazine still, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I quit when they started to ask me to do it on the phone. Can you, this story in Congo, can you do it on the phone? Well, no, you can't do it on the phone. You've really got to go. They haven't got the phone coverage in Congo.
Yeah.
So yeah, but no, I think I always knew that Time was going downhill. It was apart from the story that we all know of the internet and the loss of advertising and the decline of establishment media and so on. Time magazine, even inside that, was woefully mismanaged. It was totally top heavy with editors who had ludicrous expense accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And you just took one look at all that, all these guys driving around, all being driven around in limos and people expensing $800 bottles of wine and stuff like that, and you just sort of thought, okay, so this is not going to last.
Yeah. What was your routine in those years when you were a bureau chief abroad? I mean, how much of the time were you on the road? How much were you working at home? And what was the regime de vivre of those years like?
I guess, on a very busy year, I'd be traveling half the year.
Yeah.
Most years slightly less than that, but in India I had 7 countries in my patch, all of South Asia basically.
Yeah.
And in Africa I had 49.
Yeah.
And it was just me alone. So that was a lot of traveling. I was fine with that. That's part of the reason why I love the job so much. It was I wouldn't say it was the ideal job to be simultaneously a father to a young family.
Yeah.
So that was a juggling act. But there was a lot of travel, and I, since I stopped doing that job, I do really appreciate being at home a bit more with my kids. And
yeah. And what about the early entry into book writing? When did that first take place for you?
Well, when I was in India, and I'd done 3 years in Hong Kong as well, so I knew China, and India and China were the two sort of examples, poster boy girls of globalization, which was really, everything being published about globalization was a version of Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And it essentially sort of said, this is this miraculous process that is bringing the whole world together in a harmonious group hug. And isn't it wonderful? And quite clearly, Tom Friedman and all the others who wrote those books had no idea what they were talking about. Right. If you lived in China or India, because there, it was very clear that there were millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people were deeply unhappy about the way that capitalism had come into their country like a tsunami, and had been so disruptive. Some people had become astronomically rich, very, very few. Hundreds of millions of people had been excluded, and some of those people were unhappy enough to start revolutions.
Right.
There were loads of basically unreported riots, revolutions, assassinations, whatever, going on in China, in India and Nepal. There were separate Maoist, Marxist revolutions. All of these conflicts cited globalization as their primary cause. And when I got to Africa, I found similar kind of things. So the first book I wrote was collecting examples really from around the world to kind of make that case. In hindsight now, my first book, I would say, I think the idea is actually, the argument stands up, and in many ways, Brexit, Trump, and the rest of it is still part of that story. You know, I spent a lot of time sort of saying, well, when people get this pissed off, they tend to move to extremes, and you tend to get extreme left, extreme right reactions.
Yeah.
Well, you kind of see that with Brexit and Trump and Marie Le Pen, say, or the German far right party or the Italian government. So in some ways, I feel like the West, Europe and the States is now finally catching up actually to what's been going on in the rest of the world for 20 years.
Yeah.
Having said all of that, the argument is valid. I don't think I wrote that book particularly well.
What were the mechanics of sort of agent and publisher and stuff like that at that stage for you?
Agent I found through one of my editors at Time, who made an introduction. It was a very weird relationship I had with that agent. I never actually met them. Okay. They weren't quite sure. I was hoping for a kind of back and forth as to how we would conceptualize this book. The one thing they did I wrote it initially all about India, and they wrote back sort of saying, well, that's going to be hard to sell. Can you make it about the world?
Right.
And I sort of stupidly, said, sure. So pulled in sort of some reporting from China. I did some more reporting, pulled in a bit of reporting from Africa. I think actually I could have executed it as to be a good book. I think I had the reporting, but I did not have the writing skill to be able to do it. To structure mainly was my problem. And as some agents are, they secured a deal for it and just disappeared. Never heard from them again.
Yeah.
And so you're completely alone with this process. And I had editors at the publishers who also, minimal contact type people. I mean, I filed the manuscript hoping that this was kind of a first draft and that there would be much rolling up of sleeves and back and forth, months and months of rewriting and so on. And actually, I just got a one-word email reply saying, brilliant, and that was it.
God, okay, yeah, very worrying.
9 months later, it was published,
Yeah.
And it wasn't brilliant. It was something that I would really like to have rewritten several times.
We'll come back to the more recent books in a minute, but I wanted to talk about the kind of the post Time magazine period. So Newsweek, and then moving into freelance, and obviously to say that I worked with Alex at Newsweek, so we know each other from that period. But how did that transition all work?
Well, I quit Time. I had a book contract for my third book. Or I had one in the offing. I was pretty sure we were going to land one for a big Africa book. I guess taking a kind of similar kind of contrarian tone to my first book about globalization. This was sort of saying Africa is not what you think it is. It is not a starving baby. It is primarily a business story. And what Africans hate above all else is the aid industry, and that fundamentally this is an issue of freedom. Aid in the end is belittling to people. It takes away their agency, their freedom to make their own choices, and we in the West need to catch up to 21st century Africa. So it was an attempt to sort of overturn misperception. Mm-hmm. It was largely based on the reporting I'd done for 8 years in Africa. So it was actually just a sitting down and writing job. I did that for about a year with some extra reporting here and there. Coming out of that, I joined Newsweek with you, we were there for that jolly ride for as long as it lasted. Not even a year, was it?
should we? I mean, we can. I suppose both discuss this slightly. But so we were both on these hired by the European edition on these great deals to write just long form stuff. And I think for me, I had a great time there. I learned a great deal. But as you say, it was one of these things that perhaps seemed slightly too good to be true at the time, and it perhaps so it proved. But I don't know what your thoughts are on it in retrospect.
I mean, I loved it. I mean, God, what a contract! My contract was 10,000 worders in a year.
Yeah.
They paid me pretty well, and expenses on top, and anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to Africa. I went to Nepal. I did anything I wanted. The approval process, the pitching process, was the best I will ever have. It was literally a phone call to Richard Addis. Oh, there's been an earthquake in Nepal. I think I should go. I think you should go. Boom, you're gone.
Okay.
I loved it.
Yeah.
But yes, I don't know whether I had taken on board actually that it was too good to be true, but I probably should have done.
Yeah.
So it was when the whole thing collapsed, sort of 10 months later.
Yeah.
I was disappointed. It took me a little while to kind of recover, and I had nothing to go to.
Yeah.
10,000 worders in a year is a real sprint. I mean, that you are working all the time. I mean, you're doing a book a year, right? In 10 different stories. And I threw everything I had into that. And so I had no life outside it and no plans outside it. So when it collapsed, I was a little bit at a loss.
Yeah.
But what was going to be my 9th, I think, or 10th story for Newsweek was this story of these 3 women who stood up against the Calabrian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, and that subsequently became my 4th book. So in a way, Newsweek's collapse was a blessing, because if I'd just done it as a 10,000 word article, it probably would have ended there.
Yeah. Well, can we talk both about the specifics of the Good Mothers book, but also about the whole move to going freelance, the way you brought in TV and film work, and again, we always try and ask about money on the podcast. So how you made it work.
Well, I think I knew already that just to be, I mean, I wanted to go freelance. I was, having had 2 establishment news organisations die under me.
Yeah.
I sort of felt like, I didn't really want to do that again. And, but I also knew that being purely print long form was financially precarious, if not impossible, well, certainly with 3 children.
Yeah.
So I pursued, but with no plan, I pursued the story of the Good Mothers, did some more reporting, and then lo and behold, by then I had a different agent, Patrick Walsh, and he was working at Curtis Brown at the time, and I kept Patrick in touch with what I was doing. The guy in the office next to him at Curtis Brown was the guy that sold print stories, print books to TV and film, and he heard about the story of the Good Mothers, and I wrote a proposal for him, and he sold that to a London production company for, we didn't know what, a movie or a TV series, before Patrick had sold the book.
Okay.
But that opened my eyes to the possibility of essentially getting paid more than once for the same thing.
Yeah.
But also that process, I met all these production companies in London that was a revelation, because I was so used to being in this kind of funereal atmosphere in print journalism, where you were eking out a living and probably expecting, most of your outlets to die, and the whole world was rather bleak and depressing.
Yeah.
And TV production companies were just full of these hugely enthusiastic people who are constantly inviting you to lunch and seem to hang on your every word, but most importantly had pots and pots of money.
Yeah.
And seemed to, the pitching process. Whenever I pitched a story about, I don't know, Sudan to an editor, you could just hear them groan.
Yeah.
Because they would, oh, that's going to cost me money, isn't it? Oh dear. Whereas that just never happened with TV people. They just went, and you were like, oh right, okay, so it's this story in Sudan. and they would just say, well, write it down and send it to me. And sometimes they would buy it as a proposal for a TV series. So, in the end, I sold about 7 or 8 of those. Some of them, 1 or 2 of them, definitely are not going anywhere, but some of them are.
Yeah.
And
just on the mechanics of this. So these were like treatments, is the right word? Or they were fictional stories based on reporting that you'd done.
Sometimes it's I'd be asked to write a fact-based treatment for a documentary, for a feature documentary.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly I would take something that I covered, like say cocaine smuggling in West Africa, and pull in all the reporting I'd done, and inside that create, explain that world in 2 or 3 pages, setting out what are the dynamics, what are the players, who's doing what, what's at stake, and then suggest a fictional treatment of that.
Mm-hmm.
As in, your lead character could be this kind of guy, and he could do this kind of thing, and he'd probably meet this type of person, and he'd want to be friends with that type of person, and you just essentially you raise possibilities for a much more established screenwriter to come in and take your material and run with it. And they're not hard to pull together. I mean, you can write one of these things in over a weekend.
Yeah.
It's also not a lot of money. I mean, you sell these things, you sell an option on them for 18 months, and you might get anywhere between sort of $5,000 and 10 grand, possibly more. But you sell a few of them with book advances, with long form payments. That actually became a viable living. Yeah.
And how long did it take to kind of get that machinery, that freelancing machinery, up and running and viable?
Do you know? I mean, I think it's actually only in the last couple of months that I think I have got all those pieces in place, all my engines running, that I'm not sort of looking at my bank account, in a moment of crisis and fear, sort of every couple of weeks. It has taken quite a while, and you have to be. You just have to be very disciplined. I don't now take on any story that I don't think can be. I mean, it has to qualify to be possible to be a long form piece, to be a book, and to be a TV series or a movie. It has to tick all those boxes.
Really?
Probably all those things won't happen, but I have to at least have that potential for this to work. And if it does have that, then it's a go. And so I'm very, very picky into what I take on, because if you're going to be doing all these different things, actually it's going to be a year or 2 of your life.
Yeah.
So you've got to get that right.
Have you continued to publish the journalism as you've done the TV stuff? Has that continued?
Yeah, I mean, the journalism is weirdly, although it's that's how I define myself. It's kind of sometimes feels as though it's slightly on the side. I mean, I will knock out a piece for Guardian long reads or something. I did one last year about which was a profile of Lynn Owens and the National Crime Agency.
Yeah.
Well, I did that because I was doing a lot of research into organised crime in the UK, and that seemed a way to get my research paid for, basically. Yeah. It was also an interesting enough story, I hope. But yeah, that ultimately, my bigger idea was a TV series about organised crime in the UK.
Yeah.
Completely fictional, and I needed to know how that world worked.
And can we talk on organised crime, but not in the UK, about the Good Mothers Project, how you went about reporting and breaking into that world, and then how the TV and also the sort of New Yorker extract of that all came to pass?
Yeah, well, I told you I sold the option to House Productions in London, and that does seem like it's going to go ahead as a TV series. There's a pilot script written by a really top screenwriter. They're talking to a very prestigious director. The TV and film world moves very slowly, but I mean I'm pretty hopeful of that one.
And just to pause you there, on the financial side, you're saying that the money for an option is pretty limited, but it's like first day of principal photography, right? The big money.
That's when you get a big check. But initially, that option was decent. I think it was 15 grand, and that paid for me to go to Italy a number of times to do some reporting, speak to the sort of principles of the story, gather a lot of that book is based on judicial documents, and I was really just taking prosecutors out to lunch and handing them a memory stick and getting them to download their entire office, really. So my process was taking all that documentation, pushing it through Google Translate, which took an age, and then picking out what was the most interesting stuff and sending it to a kind of UN level translator in Italy.
Yeah.
And that it was, halfway through that process, I did sell the book. And so the advance money kept me going there. And Patrick, my agent, managed to sell editions to, I think, 5 or 6 European countries, which is little small money, but it all adds up. And I mean that. I have to say that whole process of writing and reporting that book and seeing it released, things were precarious financially. But since then, I've picked up sort of a number of other projects that have all begun to overlap. I mean, the whole thing with books and TV, you got to realize that they're a nightmare in terms of cash flow, because it's often you sign a contract, but you don't get your last payment until 3 years later.
Yeah.
So you have this awful period where you seem to have a lot of work, but nobody's paid you, and that can be ruinous. I'm now over that, which is why it's a bit more free sailing for me right now.
I mean, it's interesting. There seems to be a kind of increasing discussion in the freelance world. I don't know if you've seen this, about trying to get news organizations to not just pay on publication, right? To put money up front and to do all of that. And that's I certainly think that's a very laudable thing, because, as you say, it's not necessarily the amounts. It's the cash flow that's the pivotal thing to making it work, right?
Oh yeah, well, particularly this kind of stuff that you and I do. I'm doing a story at the moment on John Chow, the missionary that was killed in India. Yeah. Well, that involves flying to India and the US. Expenses are going to be 7 or 8 grand. Yeah. I've got to fund that, and that does feel, well, I'm used to it, but it's never felt fair.
Yeah. And can we talk about the Sniper project as well? How that came about and how that kind of work there compares to the other type?
Well, so that's a ghostwriting project. Someone who found his way to Patrick, my agent, a young Kurdish guy who escaped from Iran to the UK, became a British citizen, and then went back to Syria and fought as a sniper. Right. And was part of a very small group of snipers who essentially stopped ISIS. I mean, I think we all know the broad story of how ISIS was on seemingly an unstoppable roll, and then it certainly wasn't. Yeah. Suddenly it wasn't, and it was retreating. Well, they were stopped in a particular town called Kobani on the Turkish-Syrian border, and inside that 5-month battle, there were 5 snipers who shot 2,000 people.
Right.
I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And this guy was one of them. Yeah. So, but it was my job to, he wanted to do a book. English is not his first language, and he'd never written anything before. So I got together with him through Patrick, and he came down to my house in Hampshire for about a year, and I essentially just downloaded his story from him in an interview, and then wrote it. It's a really interesting experience, ghostwriting. I found it such an enormous relief to take any byline out of work, any kind of ego, or I always loathe that kind of self-promotional stuff, and I'm really bad at it as well. I'm really awkward at it. And so not to have to do any of that and actually to put aside yourself completely and assume someone else's voice. It was fascinating. Plus, the story was amazing. I mean, I it's only been out a few days now, but it's a real Warsaw ghetto, street by street, house by house, grinding portrait of close combat warfare. It's extraordinary.
And your name, how does it work? Your name is not on it.
No, he Azad, the sniper, he asked me when we were finishing, did I want that? And I sort of said to him, it's up to you.
Mm-hmm.
My contract was with him. He had all the power.
Yeah.
And he didn't want my name on it, so fine.
Yeah.
I am in the acknowledgements.
Sure.
And I mean, it's a relationship that could be problematic. So far, as Ad and I have, we've been sort of very gentlemanly with each other. The book picked up a lovely, heart-stopping quote from John le Carré. Which seems to be about the quality of the writing. So I'm definitely using that. But I'm sure Azad will use it too.
And how do you see things going forward from here with juggling the? Do you see yourself staying as a freelancer, or if the offer came to go back and work for a big media organization, would you?
I don't think so. I mean, every now and then these jobs come up that I would previously have considered dream jobs. I remember a few years ago there was a job at the Washington Post that was essentially, global war correspondent. The Atlantic was hiring recently, and there seemed to be some really juicy jobs there. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I've had that sort of taste of freedom. My relationship with my editors at Time in particular was generally strained, I would say. I never quite got used to the idea that some guy in New York would think up a story and go and ask me to do it without asking whether it had any value.
Yeah.
And sometimes it really obviously did not. That whole hierarchy I found problematic to telling the truth and problematic to telling good stories.
Yeah.
And I do relish the freedom I have now to spot something, follow my instincts, develop it, present it as I want it presented, and every now and then get some sort of validation in the form of a quote from John le Carré or something.
And I think when we last spoke, you were sort of dipping your toes into writing a script yourself, right? So sort of moving in the TV world across from doing original material. From doing these kind of things that then a scriptwriter would work off to writing forward. How has that been? How's that continued since we last spoke about it?
I'm such a beginner in that world. I wrote a pilot. I've shown it to very few people. They've been quite nice about it, but I can kind of tell that it's not great.
Yeah.
So it's going to take a lot of work. It's with screenwriting, I feel as though slightly that I'm floating in space. Long form journalism, writing books, I know what I'm doing. I do not know what I'm doing with screenwriting. I have sent myself on a few courses and I read all the books there are, but I am not confident that I know what I'm doing.
Is that because it's script, or is that because it's fiction? Do you think it's like taking the stabilizers off of kind of moving, to stuff where you not only can but sort of have to make stuff up?
No, it's not so much moving to fiction. It's partly to do with the format, but it's partly to do with the fact that I think it's mostly to do with the fact actually that screenwriting is incredibly formulaic. There are rules about structure for the overall arc, for each scene, for each character, and there are beats, and you can pick up any screenwriting book and they will more or less tell you the same way to structure and write a story. And it feels deeply unnatural. And part of your brain is sort of thinking, oh, well, this is why all films are formulaic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a lot of them are, and the bad ones are where you see the skeleton, you see this structure that you can read about in any screenwriting book. The good ones that play around with that a bit. Yeah. But obviously, you've got to be a bit of a, it's one of those. It's that thing. You've got to be a bit of a maestro to be able to break the rules, and I'm not at that stage yet at all.
Yeah. And I suppose the final thing: would you still do conflict journalism now?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I just, people. Apart from anything else, people always used to ask me, wasn't it really depressing doing that kind of thing? And quite the opposite. The people that you meet in the most extreme circumstances often tend to be the most inspirational, the most resilient. Their stories are the most captivating and extraordinary. I certainly don't have the kind of slightly teenage bloodlust that I used to have, which was, there was definitely, I liked the adrenaline, and I liked that small little crowd of reporters that roam the world doing hard stories. I'm not part of that anymore, but I do think that you find incredible stories in these hard places, and I think that'll always attract me. Yeah.
Yeah. Eva, do you feel that having a family changed your views on that, on taking risk and stuff like
that? Probably not nearly as much as it should. By the time I had a family, though, I would say this, that I knew I'd done quite a few wars, and I suppose I was arrogant enough to think that I knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I think my view of conflict generally is that it's not nearly as dangerous as everybody imagines it might be.
Yeah.
There are times when it is very extreme, but if I think of the 30 plus wars that I've covered, there's only 2 or 3 times actually when I've been in real danger. The rest of the time, I was just as likely to have a car accident, to be honest.
Sure. Okay, Alex. Well, we'll draw a line on this there. But look, thanks so much for taking the time. Hello, it's us again with an update from our lives. Ellie, what have you been up to?
I've been writing a lot about France for Telegraph. I recently wrote an ode to Molière, and then I interviewed Leila Slimani, who's a French author, and now I'm writing about the decline of great French cinema. So
very interesting. I've been working on various magazine projects, so a couple of Business Week assignments, and I've been hanging out at an unnamed radio station for a Guardian long read. So all very interesting. Ooh. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Zara Hankier handles our social media. And our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
You can find us on Twitter at Take Notes Always, or on Instagram at Always Take Notes, and we'd love it if you would rate and review the podcast on iTunes.
And if you like what we're doing, if you fancied contributing to our crowdfunding campaign on Patreon, that would also be great. Many thanks.
Thank you.